Welcome into episode 70 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
For over a year now, we've been doing a security podcast centered around the Mac and iOS devices, which is silly because, as we all know, there are no security issues with Apple. I mean, there are no security problems at all with Apple products. It almost seems like Apple itself sought to disprove that notion towards the end of 2017. Man, there were vulnerabilities and fixes, and those fixes led to more bugs, if not outright vulnerabilities. Then, when you tried to fix the fix, you ended up yourself reintroducing a new vulnerability. We call this Apple's no good, very bad quarter in security. I'm going to put an asterisk beside that, though. Please, somebody remind me later to say, why the asterisk? But let's first talk about what it was that made Apple's no good, very bad quarter in security. There was the worst game of password ever played. There was the I am root bug and its aftermath. There was the HomeKit zero-day vulnerability. And finally, there were the endless iOS reboots. And this was seriously all. I was actually off for the week of the I am root bug. And I can't tell you how happy I am that I was not doing daily Apple news that week, because that was a tough week to keep up with. But we'll get to that in a bit. Let's start with the worst game of password ever played ever, the APFS password hint bug.
Yeah, well, with the release of macOS High Sierra last fall, Apple also released a new type of file system called Apple File System, APFS for short. Now, APFS has a lot of benefits over earlier file systems that were used by Apple, including faster disk operations for solid-state drives, greater data protection in the event of a crash, and full disk encryption for files and metadata. That's all good. That's good improvement stuff. But there turned out to be a bug in the way that Apple implemented the password hint feature for encrypted APFS volumes, and that came to light shortly after the release of High Sierra. Basically, users can set a password hint, and it will provide a clue in the event that they forget their password to an encrypted volume. Yay, password hints can be good. But in this case, it appears that Apple accidentally got a line of code wrong, and they stored the password for the encrypted volume in plain text where the password hint was supposed to be stored.
I'm sorry. That's just, I know it's not funny. I know it's a serious thing, but that's funny.
No, it's very funny.
So when you clicked the show hint button, there wasn't a hint. It was just showing you the password.
Do you think, though, then people were like, wow, what is that? What could that hint possibly mean? Do you think they were actually getting it wrong? Or do you think everybody was just like, copy paste and you're done?
I don't know. I mean, they had a pretty quick turnaround once they were alerted to the issue. I guess they released an update to patch it within a week or so of being alerted. Mm-hmm. So that's not terrible turnaround time. Again, you kind of wonder how it got past quality assurance in the first place.
Right. And how it took so long for it to come out, too.
Because that's the thing is APFS had been in beta testing for a long time before High Sierra came out. They started talking about it 2 summers ago at WWDC.
I was going to say, I remember hearing about APFS years ago, I thought. Yeah,
and the problem was they ran into some roadblocks, actually. It wouldn't work on non-SSDs or Fusion drives. I think they just scrapped the idea entirely for those types of drives. So there are some users who don't have the benefits of it right now, even if they're running High Sierra, depending on how old their hardware is. But so it took a while to come out. And in all that time, apparently, they kind of missed this bug.
Well, maybe, who actually uses password hints? Do you? I mean, maybe somebody didn't set their password hint. So therefore, all the admins and advanced users and developers and everybody out there, nobody had password hints set. So maybe the show hint button was never enabled for all those early users.
it slipped under the radar somehow.
That's crazy. But they did fix it.
They did fix it. But the whole fact that it made it through all their testing in the first place, it actually kind of turned out to be a theme for the way this fall went with
Boy,
Apple.
it kind of seems like it, right? Because then you do come to the one that I was away for and so missed, but certainly heard about. I mean, while I was gone, because it was a big enough deal, and I always worry about when this happened. It was a big enough deal that it made local newscasts, right? But local newscasts aren't really your sharpest hotbeds for IT intelligence, I would say. And I don't think sharpest hotbed is actually a thing, but we'll work on making that a thing. Talk to me about the IM root bug.
Well, as far as worst case scenario bugs go, this one, it's pretty high up on the list. In late November 2017, a software developer posted a tweet with details of a serious security issue present in macOS High Sierra. It turns out that you could log in as the root user, which is the most powerful user on Unix-based systems like macOS, without needing to know the password at all. You could just leave the password field blank, try logging in a couple of times, and suddenly you'd be logged in as root. Now, yeah, it turns out that this security flaw had actually been noted on Apple's own developer forum for 2 weeks prior to the public post on Twitter, and it had gone completely under the radar as far as Apple's security team was concerned.
So if you wonder if Apple actually reads those forums, apparently they don't.
I was going to say, how is that possible? Unless it's just, I mean,
those forums are very community driven.
Well, what happened there was this person had some issue where they upgraded to High Sierra and they lost access to their admin account. I guess it was a bug that affected some users. So this guy said, hey, here's what worked for me. You just have to try logging in as root a couple times without a password, and then you can go ahead and re-enable your administrator account and you're good to go. Okay. So he was providing it as like a bug fix, and he apparently read about it on some other forum, and he couldn't remember the details at that point. So this is like telephone, they heard it on this place and this place and this place. But yeah, so the people who posted on Twitter were not the people who initially discovered the issue, I guess.
Okay, for clarity's sake, though, so this was not like somebody called Apple and said, hey, you seriously got this problem. It was more somebody was like, oh, well, if you can't get into that, just do this. So, I mean, it was basically...
the developer forums, that was totally like innocent, like not, this is a huge security vulnerability. The guy on Twitter was like, hey, Apple, get your act together. This is bad.
Right. Because that's interesting, because I had heard, I mean, just as you said a moment ago, Mr. Raba, Apple knew about this for a couple of weeks ahead of time, but just because something was mentioned on Apple's forum doesn't mean that Apple actually knew about it.
Exactly. So,
I mean, certainly they should have, because this is insane.
That's something that we've mentioned before in the episode when we talked about alerting Apple to security issues, is that Apple does have a security team, and they do have a security email address where you can send in security bugs. But most likely that, since it's kind of a catch-all public address, they probably have to filter through a lot of false positive reports every day.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a direct line of contact with somebody at Apple, like you have their personal email address and you can get a hold of them, if you don't have that, it's probably a bit harder to get the ball rolling, which is why when something is posted publicly on Twitter and it picks up steam, that's when you'll see Apple act very quickly, because suddenly it's at the top of attention for everybody who's important there.
Yeah, retweeting that is a lot easier than doing full write-ups, doing anything. Suddenly everybody could just become aware of the situation very quickly.
Well, which is both good, because obviously that's going to get Apple's attention, but it's bad because now everybody knows. It seems odd that you would just be able to skip the password thing a couple of times. I mean, there was a bit more to it. I mean, that's what it seemed like from the user's side, but there was a bit more to it under the hood.
Yeah, as it turned out, the bug was a bit more complex than at first glance. It wasn't letting you log in as root with a blank password. Instead, it was setting the root password to whatever you entered in the password field. It turns out that there was a logic bug in Apple's password verification code. When it tried to verify that you were entering the correct password for an account that's disabled, which is the default case with the root user account, it wasn't actually checking if the password the user entered matched the stored password. It was instead applying the user supplied password as the new password for the root account.
Actually, the technical details here are a little amusing. It turns out that Apple wasn't checking for a match. They were just checking if the call to the code to say, hey, does this match? They were seeing if that code returned essentially a value saying, hey, yeah, I ran my code routine. They checked to see if that code routine ran. They didn't actually check the result of the code routine. That's where the problem was. I mean, it's a really simple mistake in that regard that had a humongous impact in the end.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because when I came back from vacation that week and was reading over it, it sounded like this was one of those things, like every year when there's a new operating system to come out for the iPhone, they're like, oh, people can break into your iPhone. And then you find out, as long as they're actually holding your iPhone and you're right next to them. So that this thing, I mean, it ends up being this huge series of if-thens that basically mean you would practically have to open your iPhone for someone for them to be able to open your iPhone. I was under the impression that you had to have physical access to the Mac, that you had to be sitting there with the Mac to take advantage of this IAM root vulnerability. Is that right? Not
necessarily. Well, I mean, first of all, yes, if you were sitting in front of the Mac, you could obviously take advantage of it. If you're talking about a school, a large company, enterprise company, I guess Apple didn't actually patch the display units in the Apple Store after this. Like they like a week after this bug fix was released, they still hadn't patched it. But it wasn't necessarily limited to physical devices. I guess if you were running file sharing, essentially, on a server, an Apple server. So one of the colocation Macs, somewhere in a data center or whatever, if there was remote access to that system, you could actually trigger it by logging into file sharing with the same, login as root with no password type thing. So, there's obviously not that many Macs running as servers compared to Windows machines or other Unix machines, Linux machines. But that was still a possibility. Essentially, if you could try and log into the Mac from anywhere, if it's a server situation or a local, you're physically in front of the machine situation, you could trigger the bug. It was that bad.
So this became like a weird series of dominoes. I mean, the good news is once Apple heard about it on Twitter, they quickly issued a fix that proceeded to go ahead and bust up a couple of other things.
Yeah, and so they had a really quick turnaround. I mean, it was within 24 hours or something like that.
Yeah, it was fast. It was fast.
Yeah, it was real fast. The problem is, they released it so quickly that it appears that they needed some additional time for QA for their fix, and they didn't do that. The security update was considered critical enough that Apple utilized the automatic update feature. It basically means even if you didn't install the update, you didn't click the button, hey, install my updates, whatever, it will go ahead and do it. It said, the system, Mac OS would say, this is severe enough that I need to install this. And it would, without your permission or anything like that, would install this fix. That's how bad it was of a bug. So that, you're patched, whatever. Apple called it Security Update 2017-001. And that number is important, and we'll explain that here in a second. It fixed the IAM root bug, but it managed to break file sharing. So what does Apple do? They release another update, and they managed to screw that update up as well. When they released the second one to fix what they broke with file sharing, they didn't increment the version number for the update. So they called that one Security Update 2017-001 as well.
Yeah, I remember when that came in, I was like, hey, I installed this already. Why am I reinstalling it again?
So if you install it, you had to reinstall it. And this second one did fix the IAM root issue, and it managed not to break file sharing. So they fixed what they broke in the last one. But if you installed Security Update 2017-001 on a system running macOS 10.13.0, the initial release of High Sierra, and then you subsequently updated to macOS 10.13.1, you undid the fix for the IAM root bug.
Right.
And you made your system vulnerable again.
Right. Okay, so wait. So let's be clear. So you've got High Sierra running, and you've got the original one. You haven't updated yet. And then you run the IAM root fix, and then you run the other IAM root fix. But then you decide, well, okay, it's time to go ahead and upgrade to 10.13.1, which now we're up to 10.13.2, but we can get to that later. Or are we? Are we there yet? Or are we not quite there yet? I can't remember now. Anyway, then you go ahead and upgrade to 10.13.1, And that kills the both fixes that you did for IAM-root.
Yeah. So, and you've also caused a ton of confusion because now users don't know if they installed the correct patch and whatever. If they just incremented the version numbers for the security updates, it would have solved the issue. Solved some of the issue. I guess the other problem was they didn't increment the version number, like the internal version number for macOS in the fix. So the operating system itself thought that 10.13.1 was newer. Anyway, it essentially, and this final fix that they finally did still wasn't enough to fix the problem. For some reason, you also need to reboot your computer, which was something that wasn't required with the original security update 2017-001 patch. And it wasn't like Apple wasn't saying you had to reboot your computer. So if you didn't know you had to reboot your computer, so to anybody listening who has gone through this, song and dance with security update 2017-001 and you haven't rebooted your computer in a month,
right,
or however long, at whatever point this episode airs at, reboot your computer just in case.
Come on, uptimes are really cool.
Uptimes are cool, but I mean, that's really crazy. Like when you were saying you have to reboot your computer, I was like, yeah, sometimes that's a pain, but why wouldn't you? And of course, the answer is if Apple doesn't tell you you need to, then why would you?
And that was actually a little surprising. That was a little surprising with that update, because security updates, the vast majority of the time, do require a reboot because they've got to install whatever components and change whatever things. So that was the fun kind of nasty bug that Apple had, and then problems fixing the fixes.
See, Ken, like you said, you missed it. You missed out on all of this fun drama. And if you're one of those people who don't update things right away because you like other people to test it first, then you're good there for a little while. But it falls back onto the method that they push things out, and you assume that the fixes would be rolled in, updated, and all that jazz. So luckily, you did ask. We are at 10.13.2.
So now, theoretically, all that stuff is fine until somebody goes on Twitter and says, I'm not even going to make a thing up. Let's move on, because this is one that I go back and forth on philosophically, which I know may sound crazy, but we'll get into it. There was a 0-day vulnerability for HomeKit.
So, hot on the tails of the IAM-root vulnerability, Apple was hit with even more bad security news. This time, in the form of a 0-day vulnerability in HomeKit.
And for people who don't remember, HomeKit, that's basically Apple's answer to the whole home automation craze. Rather than having 10 different things with 10 different apps, you have to go through all the different apps to control your stuff. HomeKit theoretically gives you one place that you can control Internet of Things devices or IoT devices. So, fun things like, your sound system, or interesting things like your lights, or important things like your front door lock. It's a fun thing in a way, when it's only a fun thing, but then when it's, did I close the garage door? Or, is the garage door staying closed? A 0-day vulnerability for HomeKit might be anything from kind of annoying to suddenly there's access to all kinds of stuff.
Details on the actual 0-day vulnerability itself are a bit scant, but apparently all that was needed was an iPhone or iPad running iOS 11.2, the latest release for iOS at that time, connected to the HomeKit user's iCloud account. From there, the attacker could take complete control of the HomeKit connected devices and do things like unlock the front door. Apple had apparently been aware of this issue since late October, but hadn't gotten around to fully patching the problem until 9to5Mac scooped the story and let Apple know that they would be publishing information on the security flaw. That appeared to prompt Apple into picking up the pace to issue a patch, which they did within 48 hours of learning that 9to5Mac was about to publish their story.
All right. I'm still a little confused, though. This almost feels like, obviously, iCloud literally means you do not need physical access. But how is it, again, that I could take advantage of this? Like if I'm a ne'er-do-well or I'm a teenager playing a prank. If I want to unlock... So you, Mr. Raba or Mr. Tacek, have HomeKit enabled and you've got a smart lock on your front door, what is it that I then need to do to unlock that front door?
We don't actually know. What happened was whatever researcher found the vulnerability reported it to Apple in October, and Apple didn't do anything for a month. So then that security researcher, whoever it was, contacted 9to5Mac with all the details, including a working exploit, so they could test it themselves. 9to5Mac specifically decided not to publish the full details because they didn't know initially that Apple was going to have a patch in place, so they didn't want to give the bad guys a way to be bad guys. They didn't want to make it any easier for the bad guys. So we don't know exactly. From what I gather, Apple had to patch something on their server end of things. So most likely it was the iOS device with HomeKit stuff installed was communicating with Apple's server, and somehow there's some way to trigger stuff on the server side of things and cause it to unlock stuff locally. Don't know exactly how it was implemented. Obviously existed as Apple responded to it and took care of it. But again, it was one of those situations where I guess it's hard to tell from the outside whether or not Apple was dragging their feet in the sense of, hey, they want to take their time and get the patch right, unlike some of those other quick turnaround patches they had, or if they were just dragging their feet because they weren't considering it so important, or they didn't want bad press or whatever. We don't know from the outside, but it did kind of appear to be the case of they really got their act together when they found out that it was going to hit the media.
I had said as we started this particular segment that I was going to get a tiny bit philosophical, and that overstates it a tiny bit. But to me, and I don't mean to sound like an old man, but I say that more and more on this show now. To me, the smartest lock is a dumb lock. I mean, one that you need a key for. And yes, I might lose my key, but it's going to be harder for somebody to get into my house if they actually need keyed access. I mean, unless they're willing to break a window, which is a whole other deeper philosophy thing about why doesn't that happen more often? But I digress. I know you guys have different feelings on Internet of Things. You're not completely against them, but you worry that people are sort of rushing headlong into them, not really thinking about the security implications. Would either of you ever have a smart lock as the way to get into your house?
No.
If I ran Airbnb homes and I needed to change passcodes and things like that to give certain people different access or entry, or to lock them out during certain hours or days or things like that, I could see good use cases there. As far as my personal home, would I do it? I mean, I got this vintage door with these vintage locks, and it just looks really, really pretty. So until one of these new age companies makes really pretty hardware, I'm not going to be looking at it for a while.
I guess, I say I wouldn't do it, but at the same time, if somebody wants to get into your house, the front door and the front door lock isn't necessarily the way to go. Go around the back of the house and break a window. That's how it happens, in all honesty. Right. Locks keep honest people honest. Is pretty much what it comes down to. So I guess it doesn't really matter, but it's kind of the fact that there was it didn't necessarily just have to be the locks. I mean, it could have been somebody turning off your thermostat completely in the middle of winter and your pipes freeze and break, and then you've got a humongous bill. That's more of a, potential devastation type thing, and then.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a very good point, because yeah, that's not targeting you specifically. I mean, again, not to make light of any other like iOS security problems that we've talked about in the past, but there was the one a couple of weeks ago or a few weeks ago as we record this now where, some company had been able to beat Face ID with a mask, but it wasn't like you'd walk into Walmart and, pick up like a Halloween mask. I mean, it was really intricate. Same thing would probably be said for anything that's going to target a specific home lock, but massive. Yeah, all the lights of all the hues came on at 3 a.m. all across the neighborhood for absolutely no reason. I mean, again, or everybody's thermostat got turned off and suddenly all the pipes broke in an entire neighborhood or something. That's fun. I might stick with my dumb devices. Well, and my computer and my iPad and my phone and my smartwatch.
If I had that rental house, or I had that winter home or whatever that had had the cooling issues by it getting really freezing cold in North Dakota, then having one of those smart thermostats or any of those devices are really cool to keep you informed about what's going on. Like, hey, look, your house is now 30 degrees or negative 20 degrees, and you go, oh, something didn't fire up right. Something's not happening right. And at least you know what's going on there. So it's one of those pros and cons about all this technology. I mean, there's a lot of good use for it.
We've got one more item to hit, and I don't think this is... Well, I mean, you could argue that it's a security issue because if you can't get into your phone, then you can't call emergency services or you can't call a family member or something like that. It still kind of reads as funny, with a side of raising a question about what the heck was going on inside Apple. The last one we're going to hit today, I guess, would be at least as much a QA thing as a security issue. Talk to me about the endless iOS reboots.
There's a funny thing. This one, actually, I sent out a warning to my family and friends on Facebook before this bug hit, because I had people in Australia were getting hit with it. It basically triggered at 12:15 a.m. on December 2nd, 2017. So you knew ahead of time that it was coming because of other time zones. And it wasn't
Is this like the Y2K bug?
Yeah, kind of. So I sent out a warning to family members on Facebook and said, hey, here's what you should do ahead of time to stop this from happening. And some friends actually responded saying they got hit with the problem. My father-in-law, I talked about them in previous episodes that they always seem to have the bad luck with computer security stuff. He got hit with it too on his iPhone. So I got a call in the early morning hours to help fix it. And again, this wasn't a security one per se, but was definitely causing devices to stop working, more or less. It was a bug with local notifications, and all over the world, iOS devices would kind of go into this endless, it would appear to users to be a reboot cycle. It was a little more complex under the hood than that, but basically, after 12:15 a.m. on December 2nd, some iOS devices would start using 100% of the CPU and then perform what's called a soft reset. So it's kind of rebooting the, it's called the springboard. It's what actually runs your apps on an iOS device. So when you're on your home screen, you see all your apps, that's the springboard. It would be a soft reset to reboot that. And once the device was back up and running, the same thing would happen again after a minute or two. So your device essentially went to an endless loop of being unusable if you couldn't get it fixed within that brief window of time when it was running. And it turned out that apps that were generating local notifications on a repeated daily or hourly schedule would cause the bug to trigger. And this wasn't all apps with all notifications, because most notifications go through, the internet, push notifications or stuff like that. You get a notification from, Starbucks or your server, Amazon, something like that. You get a message on your phone. That's not local to your phone. That's coming from somewhere else on the internet. But there are some apps, a lot of reminder apps, or I think there's some meditation apps, stuff like that. Here, it's your hourly reminder to do your deep breathing exercise. Suddenly your phone's not working and you've totally failed that exercise. Basically, that was causing the bug to trigger. So Apple's initial response was that users should go ahead and change the date on their iOS device back a day. So instead of December 2nd, change it back to December 1st until they could get a software update out. And so that was the initial news. I mean, I guess App Store Genius bars were saying to do that. People on forums were saying that. And then it turned out that that wasn't the best response, because if you change the date on your device, it could break some apps, especially those that relied on encryption to work properly. So if you had a logged in
SSL stuff,
if you had a logged in session to a service or an account on your phone, I think WhatsApp would fail. It would just basically fail. It wouldn't work anymore. So like that. So you wouldn't be able to use your apps because you changed the time and date on your phone. And that was a security considerations, the way the stuff works. But I'm sure Apple wasn't thinking about that when they suggested that for users to solve the other bug. So the correct solution actually turned out to be to disable notifications for apps. If the notification wasn't being displayed, the bug wasn't being triggered. And in the end, Apple did release iOS 11.2, which solved the problem. And then it appeared they released it too early again. iOS 11.2 had been in beta testing with developers for about 14 hours, and then Apple pushed it live for everybody. Like, public release after 14 hours of testing. Well, it turned out that Xcode which is the program that developers use to write apps for macOS and iOS, it hadn't been updated to recognize iOS 11.2 as a legitimate public release version. So developers found themselves in the position of being unable to release apps for the newly updated iOS devices, because Xcode thought it was still a beta version of iOS. In the end, Apple did release an update a couple days later for Xcode, and everything finally got back to normal. But yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride.
You know what? Thank you for that tweet, because at that time I was a couple time zones behind you, so I was able to double check everything and like make sure that some of these things wouldn't happen to my phone. So yeah, that's Twitter right there winning.
What's crazy to me, though, is I missed all of those tweets, but I also didn't have this problem. I guess what I'm wondering is, well, and we'll never know. I mean, like, how big a problem was this that Apple actually 14 hours of testing and then pushed it out? Not only that, but they pushed it out on a Saturday, which I thought was rare, but it turns out never happened before. Before 11.2, they had never pushed out a big update on a Saturday like that.
No, and I mean, considering the scope of it, though, when it started hitting in Australia and they saw how many users were affected by it, and again, it really depended on what apps you had installed. And I'm sure, depending on where you're at in the world, maybe some countries were more prone to having apps that utilized that feature of iOS and triggered the bug. But because the phone would kind of go into this cycle of soft resets, they knew that was going to essentially, for 99% of users, they were going to think their phone was broken. And that was going to cause a humongous support issue if they let it go any longer than they had to, which is why they pushed that software update so quickly.
And you would certainly rather have the news story be Apple clumsily fixed something than 50% of the iPhones around the world stopped working on Saturday. But
again, it kind of leads us back to that question of what's going on with Apple's software quality assurance and testing this fall, because this is release after release after release of really buggy software.
This actually brings us to the asterisk that I mentioned at the top of the show. We're talking about Apple's no good, very bad quarter for security and QA. But I mean, first of all, I don't want to be an apologist for Apple. It really does sound like there are lots of ways that a lot of this could have gone a lot worse. I mean, yes, they did clumsily fix things, but they did fix things. But really what I'm wondering is, in our crazy news cycle right now, and our, 5 things a day that are enough to make you want to jump out a window and hopefully not be too high off the ground when you do it. I mean, how are we going to remember this next week, next month, next year? I mean, is this indicative of something bad, or is this just something that we're going to look back and go, do you remember when that happened? That was crazy.
Well, hopefully this quarter coming up isn't full of things like this. Yeah. And hopefully it's just a thing of the past.
If it was an isolated incident, like if one of these issues had occurred, I think it would be, off people's radar within a month or two. This endless reboot thing will probably come up every time you have like a time zone shift. You'll have bloggers say, hey, remember that time that the iPhone stopped working in December? That's probably is going to be mentioned in passing. The I am root one, I think that's going to be up there with the go to fail bug last year or a couple years ago. That one sticks in people's memory because it was a really kind of idiotic mistake in the end, a coding mistake, which is what this I am root one was. So I think that one will definitely stick around. I mean, that's up there in terms of
for the average consumer, though, or for the security minded consumer.
I'd say for security minded. For average consumers, though, I think this fall will probably leave a bit of a bad taste in their mouth as far as Apple goes, because I mean, for years Apple was known for the quality of hardware and software. I mean, yes, there were bugs and everything, but I don't think we've been piled on with this many severe security bugs in so short a time span in recent memory. So I think it is making people outside of security professionals even say, what's going on in Cupertino?
I don't know. Tax bills, Russia investigations, weird weather, fires. I don't think the general consumer is going to remember this, honestly. And that's why I put the asterisk beside it. I mean, it really is, as Mr. Robb said a moment ago, if you've got another quarter of this, then I think you start to have more of a concern. But I'm guessing by Christmas morning, when people are opening their iPhones or opening their new iPads or their Macs or whatever, They're not worried about the security issue. They're just excited about the new stuff that they have. And for the most part, because remember that time? Do you remember which phone it was that came out that there was then soon an update, and then it killed cellular connectivity for all of the phones? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think he's trying to make a point right now.
And you're a security dude. That's what I'm saying. It was iPhone 6. It was iOS. I can't remember if it was iOS 7 or iOS 8, but it was iPhone 6 that came out. And if you immediately updated the update that came out a couple of days after that phone, it just hosed the cellular connectivity for a lot of people. But man, we're still buying iPhones.
That is true.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. It's definitely something worth watching. And as you said a moment ago, Mr. Rabba, hopefully, maybe it was you, Mr. Tonchek, one of the Nikolai said, hopefully we're looking back in a month going, man, that was weird, as opposed to, man, that was the start of something.
Yeah, and if you haven't done so yet, make sure you update the operating system so the I am root bug is finally fixed if you haven't done so already.
No, you don't need to update it. It does it automatically. You just need to make sure you reboot.
So quick question though, if you for whatever reason are still on Sierra, not High Sierra, was I am root actually a thing that affected you?
Nope, it was something introduced with High Sierra. That was, again, it was new code, new bug is what the theme has been.
All right, so that's good. Hey, if you'd like to revisit some of the points that we hit today, we have a website that we would love for you to check out. It is securemac.com/checklist. There you'll find notes for, this show, and the one before that, and the one before that one, and the ones that come after this show too. securemac.com/checklist is the address. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you would like to hear us hit, we have an email address we'd love for you to use. Checklist@securemac.com is that address. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, even after I said it 5 times, please, please, please do remember this. You are listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.